You're now listening to the Engage the Rockies podcast, your go-to podcast for local and state issues concerning Colorado.
Hello, Rockies. This is Sarah Jane Maroney, your host. And this week we are joined by Senator Barbara Kirkmeyer. She's a fourth-generation Coloradan who has lived in southern Weld County for over 35 years. She graduated from University of Colorado with a degree in physical education and previously has held the position of Weld County Commissioner. After her tenure in Weld County, it is the only large Colorado county debt-free. She also helped coordinate an effort to make the county a Second Amendment sanctuary county. Barbara Kirkmeyer has previously owned and operated a dairy farm, was a small business owner for 15 years, and served in Governor Owens' cabinet as the acting executive director of the Department of Local Affairs. Both her daughters graduated from Weld County schools and live with their families in southern Weld County. When not involved in legislative-related business, Senator Kirkmeyer enjoys volunteering, spending time with her family, including 6 grandsons. We welcome her. Senator Kirkmeyer, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to be here.
So this isn't your freshman term as a senator. You've been around the block a few times. Maybe give us a little bit of your background in terms of politics.
Sure. I started off being a county commissioner. So I served a total of 20 years as a county commissioner. But that 20 years was split up because I went and served on Governor Owens' cabinet as eventually being the executive director of the Department of Local Affairs. So I did that for about 6.5, 7 years. And then I went back to being a county commissioner because it's a great job. And then from there, that ended the end of 2020, after COVID.
Yes.
During COVID, I guess. And then I ran for state senate and got elected. And I am in my second term of being a state senator up here in Weld County is where I'm from.
Right. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your service. And you are on the JBC, the Joint Budget Committee. Maybe could you give a little tiny overview to our listeners about what that means?
Yeah, so there are 100 members in the General Assembly. 6 of us serve on the Joint Budget Committee. So it's 3 from the Senate, 3 from the House. The majority party gets to appoint 2 people, and the minority party appoints 1. So it's a 4-2 committee. There are 4 Democrats and 2 Republicans on there. Myself and Representative Taggart from Grand Junction is the other Republican that's on the committee. So the legislative branch is actually responsible for adopting and passing a budget. And the Constitution requires that we have a balanced budget when we pass the budget. So again, it's the legislative branch that does that. It's the Joint Budget Committee that actually writes the budget and then presents to the rest of the members, the other 94 members, for their approval. Now, the governor does have a requirement as well to put in a budget request, and that starts in November. Like on November 1, he has to submit a budget request, and then he has the opportunity to amend his request all the way through about January or so. But it does change as we go through the process. The Joint Budget Committee is pretty much a year-round committee. Starting in November, however, we're pretty much full-time. Right after the election, we started back up, and we've been meeting since then so that we get briefed, we go through hearings, figure setting, and then we write the budget.
Wow.
So we're in the process right now. Just went through, our chair is a state senator, so the budget starts in the Senate. And we just did our week in the Senate last week. It takes about a whole week for it to get through one chamber. And this week it'll be going through the House. The other 94 members have their opportunity to put their fingerprints on the budget and tell us what they believe the priorities should be for the budget and make amendments, that type of thing. And then the Joint Budget Committee comes back together and we serve as the conference committee for the budget. It's called the long bill. It's actually a bill that does get passed. And that could take us another week to 10 days. I mean, it could take a while. Depends on how many amendments are in place and, kind of what's also going on with regard to dollar amounts. I mean, sometimes our members, even though we're in a structural deficit right now, think that they should be spending more money. And I'm like, you need to stop spending. So, but it'll be another 2 weeks at least before we get the budget closed and it heads to the governor for signature.
Okay. So does that mean that you don't serve, the people that are on the Joint Budget Committee then don't serve on any other committees because you're doing this all the time?
Pretty much. The only other committee that we serve on is appropriations, which is tied in directly to the budget. So all 3 Joint Budget Committee members in both chambers serve on the appropriation committees in their respective chambers. And then, from my perspective, once we get done with the budget, there are some of our members, like in the Senate, because there are only 12 Senate Republicans out of 35, that they may be on 3 or 4 committees. And so, I'll try and give them a break if I can, if there's committees meeting or, we have some different situations arise. People need some time off or they need because of family or medical type situations. So I'll go serve on committee. Like last week, after we kind of got done with the budget on, I think it was Thursday of last week, I ended up sitting on the local government committee and filling in for Senator Baisley. So I'll do stuff like that too, because why not? Help out my fellow members.
Yes, wonderful. And I read the other day that the budget, it was 278 pages, but you're explaining that that's actually a bill that has all the line items and all the things in it. So it makes sense that it would be the long bill.
Yes.
But it also has an orbital. Tell me a little bit about that. I was like, what? What is this?
So not everything can fit into the budget. There'll be things like, especially this year, because we are in a structural deficit, which is caused by a lot of overspending that has occurred. And keep in mind, all 3 chambers are controlled by the Democrats. They are the majority party. And we've just been overspending for the last 6 years, year over year overspending. There are times.
Let me just interrupt you for 1 second. How is that possible? Because with Tabor, it has to be balanced.
So we did balance the budget, but we overspent in areas and we used one-time funds. So remember during COVID, we received a lot of, they were called ARPA dollars. So federal dollars flooded into the state. And I'm talking like billions of dollars came in. Some went directly to departments in the governor's administration. Some went to counties, so like El Paso County received a direct distribution during COVID of federal dollars, things of that nature. So they were spending those, and those were supposed to be one-time expenditures. And what happened is we ended up in replacing those with ongoing general fund. And so we ended up in a structural deficit. And again, it's just flat out, it's overspending. And this year we needed to cut. We didn't cut as much as we needed to, but we did things like where we swept cash funds, took interest from cash funds, and moved those all over into the general fund. But we still, you don't spend your way out of a structural deficit. So it'll be a multi-year. I don't know that we'll get all the way out of a structural deficit even in the next budget cycle, but we do have a balanced budget, but I call them shell game shenanigans, moving money around kind of thing. I think we've pretty much done everything we can do with regard to moving money around. And next year, we are going to have to get down to the business of cutting the budget. Now, keep in mind in the budget, there are 20 departments in the executive branch. And then there is the judicial branch. So we get budget requests from them as well. We have to go through that budget and we have to make it all reconcile. And then we also have the other elected officials like the Attorney General, the Treasurer, and the Secretary of State that also have to present their budget to the Joint Budget Committee. Now, the legislative branch, which I am in and the Joint Budget Committee is in, they do their own budget and then they just kind of like give it to us. It doesn't mean we can't make changes or, work to make changes, but this is where you get orbital bills because moving things from one cash fund to another cash fund or from a cash fund to a general fund, those are, for the most part, those are things, increasing spending authority, those types of things are things that go into the long bill. But if we have to change statute, like if funds were supposed to be being spent in one area, like we did end some programs because they just have been around for a long time or they weren't doing what they were supposed to do. But if we do that, we have to actually go in and change statute. And you can't have substantial statutory changes in the long bill itself, other than some of those things I mentioned. But if we have to change statute, then we have what's called an orbital bill. And it orbits around the budget essentially, and it goes through at the same time as the long bill because balancing the budget is contingent upon the orbital bills that we have. Now, for it to be a bill that the JBC carries, the Joint Budget Committee carries, it has to be approved by all 6 members. So the Joint Budget Committee is one of those places where even if you're in the minority, you still have a lot of influence over what's going on and how the budget is being written kind of thing. So we have this year, I don't know, somewhere between 60 and 80 orbital bills that are running with the long bill. So we had several done as we were going through our chamber in the Senate that went with the long bill, but they couldn't really literally just get them all written. There are just so many bills. We're transferring money from one account to another account. That takes a bill. It's things of that nature. So
is that a lot of number of orbitals per, this isn't your first rodeo on the JBC either, correct?
Correct. I'm in my third year of being on the Joint Budget Committee. It's my third year. So it's the most bills I think that we've had surrounding the budget, at least while I've been there. I think back in 2020, they had quite a few as well because they had to make a bunch of changes because of COVID and how that impacted our budget. So, but yeah, I mean, we had a lot last year, but this year it seems like there's just a lot more. So yeah. Yeah.
Is this something, I mean, obviously you want to be a legislator. Obviously you are happy in the job, but that does seem like quite an arduous task. Did you ask originally in your first term to be put on the JBC?
Yeah, I did. And I did end up being on in my first term because Senate terms run 4 years. So I got on midterm. So I spent 2 years in my last term being on the Joint Budget Committee. And I love my job. I mean, it is arduous. It does take a lot of time. There are times like last year, we might be there till 2 a.m. trying to close out the budget. This year, the budget was a week late, but our chair ran things a little bit differently. Pretty much after 7 o'clock, people are tired and sometimes they aren't making best decisions, or maybe people like me are like, hey, let's keep going because I'm getting what I need. But we tried not to work past 7 o'clock. We had a few nights where we were there till like 8:30, 9 o'clock, but it's a long day because the only time you have for meetings is when you're outside of the Joint Budget Committee, and everybody wants to meet with the Joint Budget Committee members to tell them how important their programs are and why you should fund their program and not somebody else's, or things of that nature. So it ends up being a pretty long day. I would say I start with meetings. I'll be on the phone while I'm driving into work starting at 7:30 in the morning. And, when you're going to 7 o'clock at night or 8, 9 o'clock at night, it gets pretty long days. I do like my job. It was something as a county commissioner in my county, Weld County, was able to lead my county to zero debt and lower the mill levy by 7 mills. So I like this position, and I know a lot about state government, mostly because when you're a county commissioner, you have to implement and you're mandated, those unfunded mandates that counties have to implement. So you implement a lot of the state programs.
Well, you would be a good person. I don't want to step too far away from the budget, as I had a few more questions about that. But
Yeah.
evidently, Douglas County have started the process towards home rule. And since you were a county commissioner in Weld, would you talk a little bit about what home rule means?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to sound silly, but it means exactly that you get to rule at home, and the legislature doesn't get to control certain things in your county. So, and it's all constitutional. So back in 1975, it was passed that counties could go to home rule, and there's a process that you have to go through. It sounds like you've kind of been reading up on it with Douglas County, but there's a process you have to go through, and it has to go to a vote. You have to develop a charter. Same as a city. Cities have to develop a charter as well when they go to home rule. You have a home rule charter committee. It goes to a vote, and then you determine what's in your charter. For counties, it's a bit different than it is for municipalities. I think municipalities go above and beyond and have more power in a home rule municipality than we do in a county, but there's quite a bit there. There are certain things though that are identified in the Constitution that you can develop your charter around. So for example, in our county, we have what's called a county council. They are all volunteer. They meet once a month. They only have certain duties. One of their duties is that if there's a vacancy on the Board of County Commissioners, they get to appoint the county commissioner, to fill that vacancy. So that's something that's different from a home rule county to just a statutory county, right? A regular county. And we set our own salaries. So we're not at the whim of the legislature, of the General Assembly, who sets the salaries essentially, or they set at least the categories and different things. They're not as prescriptive as it used to be, but they can set the salaries for county commissioners and other elected officials in the county. In our county, the county council gets to set the salary for the elected county officials. And then we have things in our charter that limit our procurement rules, and we have to give preference to those businesses that are in Weld County. There's provisions that we don't get to have a county manager. I mean, there are certain things that you can, as a county in home rule, again, in accordance with what's in the Constitution, change and put into your charter. For example, in Weld County, individuals can petition the county and put things on the ballot. Otherwise, that doesn't occur in other counties.
Interesting.
It is interesting.
I'm curious, did Weld County, is the salary for a county commissioner higher or lower than what the state dictates to the counties that don't have home rule?
Well, since we are in a category 1, so that's like we're El Paso and, we're in the Big 10 counties. So we're in a category 1. Our salaries are usually less than what is prescribed in statute. It runs fairly close, but it's still, there for a while, they were less because people who would run for county commissioner and lose would go get on the county council, and then they set the salary. So for a while there were a few years there where they would purposely keep the salary low. But, over the course of the last, I would say probably 12 to 16 years, they're fairly close with regard to county commissioners.
Curious. Interesting. Well, in terms of budget, so if we swing back over to the JBC, we covered an article in our weekly updates where you were quoted, or you had found
Shocker.
furniture money in the budget.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
They'll probably never invite me back or let me back on that committee. So there is a legislative committee. And remember I said that the legislative branch writes their own budget and then they just give it to us at the Joint Budget Committee. And so any amendments to that have to happen through the General Assembly process. And it doesn't necessarily happen over at the Joint Budget Committee. We could try, but again, so there is a legislative committee that meets, and it's leadership. There's leadership committees that meet. They help develop the budget for the legislative branch, and then they present that to this legislative committee, which is leadership plus, I don't know, it seemed like there were about 20 people on this committee because it's both House and Senate. So maybe it was 18, I don't know, 9 from each committee. I don't know how that worked, but it seemed like there were a lot of people there that day. I actually filled in for Senator Lundeen. He wasn't able to make the meeting. So he asked me, he's like, well, they're going to be talking about the budget. So maybe you could go and you could be there. And I thought, okay. So I went, and I was the only one who started asking questions. I'm like, what is this legislative cash fund? Like, is that general fund originated, or like what fee would we be collecting cash funds from? Well, I don't think they really wanted to tell me because they kind of worked their way around the conversation. And I finally looked at the individual who was there representing, different divisions, different offices in the legislative department. I said, I'm going to take that as general fund. And so now I need to know what we're spending that on and what kind of balance do we have in the legislative department cash fund. So we appropriate funds to the legislative branch. It's about $80 million. If they don't spend all of the $80 million for the last 4 or 5 years, it's been averaging about $5 million, reverts or it rolls over into this cash fund that then they can spend on things. I mean, they have to go through their process. But remember, the Democrats are the majority. So they have the most people on these legislative committees, and they can outvote the Republicans, obviously, because we're in the minority. But at one point, there had been up to $53 million in the cash fund over the course of the last 11 years. But they've been spending it down, and they were using it to do some renovations in the Capitol, both in the Senate and in the House, and buying some, like iPads and computers and IT kind of stuff, which, if we're appropriating them enough money, I don't know why they needed this cash fund, but they rolled it over into there and they said they were using it for renovations. Well, as I'm looking through the expenditures of the cash fund, there was $4 million slotted for new furniture. I'm like, we're in a structural deficit. The governor's coming in with proposals that cut funding to neglected and abused kids, that cuts funding to other child welfare programs, that cut Medicaid. I mean, you've been hearing the Democrats talk about how bad Trump is because he's cutting Medicaid. Well, he has not cut Medicaid, at least not at that point. I don't believe that he'll actually cut parts, the most common core part of Medicaid, but they're complaining about Trump cutting all these things. And I thought, you guys were cutting all this. And in the meantime, we've got this cash fund that I'm not going to say it's a slush fund because it's not nefarious or illicit what they're spending the dollars on, but it's like this fund that they just have. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. It had $22 million in it in a balance, and they were going to spend $4 million on furniture and then like another 4 or 5 million on other renovations. And I'm like, look, we appropriate to the capital renovation cash fund. We appropriate funds to that. And so anyways, we appropriate funds to these other cash funds like the capital renovation cash fund. So there's no need for us to be rolling funds into this other legislative cash fund that's just sitting there. So $22 million, $4 million of it was slotted for new furniture. So I'm just like, this is unreal to me. Even after they were said they would transfer some money back to us in the general fund. I thought, oh, gee, isn't that generous of you? So I tried several amendments, and I got a couple of things pushed through, but there still is essentially, I think it's about 8 or 9 million, maybe not quite that much, because I think I guilted them into transferring a few more million over to us, but there's still somewhere around $6 to $9 million sitting in a cash fund. And I just think that's very disappointing. And it's not very fiscally responsible for us to just have money sitting in a cash fund so they can go spend it on something that is not
and
a
who
priority.
would be in charge of deciding what gets spent? I mean, obviously, if they need iPads or things, there would have been an expenditure line for technology for the Capitol, because people need the tools to do their jobs. But
Exactly. And they would use it like they paid for the tax commission. They had people who were helping to staff the tax commission, and they paid them. And I'm like, well, those people worked as aides. Like, why were we paying them? I'm like, more. I don't know. But anyways, there's just stuff like that. And so the people who get to decide, it's this legislative committee that I sat on. They get to make recommendations, or they vote on it. And it's a recommendation to the leadership committee, which is the speaker, the majority leader, and minority leader out of the House, and the president, the majority leader, and minority leader out of the Senate. So it's a 4-2 committee in this case, 2 Republicans and 4 Democrats, and they make the final decision. And then we do vote on it, but it's a bill, and it's very hard to get it changed when you're in the minority. But I got more money out of them, but I didn't get everything. And I did make hay out of the fact that here we are, governor is cutting funding to neglected and abused kids. The governor's early childhood department cut off a contract for early intervention programs, which are kids with special needs. And we had to go in and fund additional there. And so they're cutting programs that are important, that you truly have an impact on people's lives, especially children. And we're cutting, the governor's saying, let's cut these programs. Meanwhile, hey, in the legislative branch, let's go buy new furniture. And, my comment was, when you're sitting around your own kitchen table or your own table or whatever, and you're trying to decide what your own household budget is, if you can't afford to take your kid to the doctor, you don't turn around and say, hey, but I think I'll go buy a new dining room table. That doesn't happen. And we shouldn't be doing that in state government either. So they weren't too happy with me. And I'm pretty sure they won't ever let me back on that committee.
Maybe Senator Lundeen doesn't think your subbing was such a good idea, or maybe that was his whole plan.
He was good with it. I'm pretty sure the Democrats didn't like it, though, especially the ones in leadership. But it was all right. I mean, I think it just pointed out what I think is a flaw in how we do budgeting at the state.
Sure. So yeah. I guess as we're concluding here, we've talked a lot in various interviews about public safety, we spoke with Congressman Evans about Medicaid and lots of these different things. As a legislator, how much control do you have to decide? And obviously you were in the minority party, but how much can you say, hey, we should fix these roads. There are potholes all over Colorado, or gosh, we should fund some of these programs for indigent children, et cetera, et cetera. How much can you do?
Because I'm on the Joint Budget Committee, it's the place where the minority really does have influence. And, I want to say power, but I don't know. I'm not trying to say I'm power hungry or anything of that nature, or anybody on the committee is, but you have a lot of influence and a lot of power, and you can make a lot of changes. So, because again, before you can carry a bill and change statute, all 6 members of the Joint Budget Committee have to agree. And it takes all 6. And if they start going crazy like they did last year, and they started rolling myself and Representative Taggart, kind of rolling us on the votes and saying, oh, well, it's a 4-2 vote, it's this and that. And because some things, not everything takes legislation. That's when we got up and walked out and left. Said we were done, that, they should have been more respectful of us, and got up and walked out. And they have to have a member of the minority present, or they don't have a quorum, and they can't vote and they can't do anything. So it is an area all the way up until the budget is finalized that the minority actually has some pretty good say in things. I'm in close contact, and I know that Representative Taggart is as well, with our leadership. Like, I talk to Senator Lundeen, who is my minority leader. I talk to him all the time and during the budget and say, here's what's going on. Here's where I'm headed. I talk with my caucus, make sure, I tell them what I believe the priorities are within the state budget. And for me, it's always been about funding education, because that's a constitutional mandate that we fund education. Higher education is extremely important, along with Medicaid provider rates, and then also child welfare. And those are my top four priorities. I believe we should fund those first and then start funding their pet projects. Let's see how much money we really have left over. And in a year when we have a structural deficit, it's pretty much zero. So, we should have been doing more cuts, and we didn't do as many cuts as we should have done of general fund monies. But so I would say, being on the budget, you have a lot of influence, and I really appreciate my caucus. Senator Lundeen is great to work with as a minority leader. I mean, he's phenomenal, and we have great interaction, and we develop strategy about how we use the influence of the Joint Budget Committee to get things either adopted on the floor or get things eliminated out of the budget.
So I guess that is my final question. If that's the case, Colorado has switched. It used to be red and it is now blue. Do you think that the opposite was true, as in those years when red had control of the Joint Budget Committee and that there were more members that were Republicans versus Democrats? Do you think the Democrats did somewhat similar things in terms of their priorities and asserting their influence?
I don't think they did. Not that I know of. I mean, because prior to me being on the Joint Budget Committee, and I'd only served 2 years prior to, as a state senator. But as a county commissioner, I interacted with the Joint Budget Committee quite a bit. And certainly I did the budget for the Department of Local Affairs, so I interacted with the Joint Budget Committee there. There was more of a balance through some of those years, because remember, if the House is majority in one party and the Senate is a different majority, then you have a 3-3 vote. And you definitely have to work across the aisle, and you definitely need to develop those relationships. And regardless, whether you're in the majority or the minority, I would say you need to develop relationships and work through that, because there's an 80-20 rule. About 80% of the stuff we're in agreement on. And there's about 20%, sometimes they're not the 20%, you like, but whatever, that we don't agree on. So it's important that you develop relationships and you develop that idea of compromise, because even like this year, Senator Bridges, who's the chair, was working very diligently to make sure everybody had a voice and that nobody was cut off. But at some point it gets to the Democrats are like, well, we've got the majority, so we're just going to vote. And we, whatever, the way the vote goes is the way the vote goes. And we have to finish up the budget. And it's like I told him at one point, I said, you do that and you disregard myself and Representative Taggart, I'll be a no on the budget. And that bothers them, because the budget is really our bill that we're pushing forward, right? And, like even this year, all the other Republicans vote no on the budget, and I was the only Republican in the Senate that voted for the budget. But again, it's basically our bill. And so, but, once the budget
you would
is
have,
done,
don't you have to? I mean, isn't that?
I don't have to, but it's usually, I don't know a time when, well, I just don't know in the last 4 years when the minority party has voted no on the budget. That's on the person who's on the JBC. But I would just say,
what would happen though? I mean, you said you have to have at least.
They still have to have 18 to pass the long bill, because it's a bill. So 18 members still have to vote for it. And they have 23 members. So, it's not an issue unless you get some Democrats or, somebody from the majority party, 5 or 6 of them don't want to vote for the budget. Then it starts becoming a problem. So anyways.
Sure.
But no, it's very interesting, but I would just say last year, like when, my second year on the Joint Budget Committee, I had a better feel for it. And I started pushing the rules and just saying, look, if you're going to be rude to me, I'm going to be, I'm just going to get up and leave until you really truly are approaching this as a partnership and respecting the relationships that we all have on the Joint Budget Committee, because we're all responsible to write the budget. It's not just the majority party. And, I thought that was good. But, again, I was in close contact with Senator Lundeen, and I was telling him what I was going to do. And he's like, really? And I'm like, yeah. But he had my back and supported it. And again, we talked through the strategy of it. You can't push too far, because then they just start ignoring you. But at the same time, you can demand respect.
Absolutely. Well, wow. Senator Kirkmeyer, I have learned so much. I really have. This has been fascinating. Yeah. I don't know a lot about budgets, but this is intriguing, and I hadn't heard any of these things before. So very thankful for your input, and hopefully your budget will go through the House and come back quickly.
Yeah, it'll be another week or so, but we'll see how it goes. Should be fine.
Well, hopefully we can have you on again. We really appreciated your input.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate your time, and thanks for having me. It's been great to be able to explain the budget to y'all.
Thank you for listening to the Engage the Rockies podcast, your go-to podcast for local and state issues concerning Colorado.